Okay, so first, I just wanted to share this QR code. If anybody wants to download my slides, if that makes it easier for you to follow along, go ahead and do that. While we're waiting for people to do that, I'll put my instructor hat on for a second. So raise your hand if you've used ChatGPT at all to perform some type of bioinformatics task. Okay, quite a few of you. Hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll feel like maybe that's something that could be a useful thing for you to do if you haven't already. So. Okay, I also wanted to start out by acknowledging my co-authors and collaborators. I was fortunate to do a sabbatical down in New Zealand and collaborated with some computer science education researchers down there on this project, and also some of my colleagues at BYU. I also wanted to thank some teaching assistants we've had over the years who have helped with preparing some of the programming exercises that I'll talk about in my talk today. Okay, and I think it's probably not a secret to anybody here that there's a need for biologists to use computing techniques in their research. Pretty much everybody needs some form of computing tools in their research. We're going to talk today specifically about programming. There was a study back in 2011 where they surveyed scientists from many different disciplines, not counting computer science, and they found that on average, scientists spent about 35% of their time writing code. So if we can speed up that process, make it more efficient, help with training needs, things like that, anything along those lines could be a really useful thing for the field. Okay, so I want to clarify one point, which is the difference between bioinformaticians' needs and then what in the computer science education community people call end user programmers. So when I think of a bioinformatician, I think of somebody who that's their primary responsibility in their work or their studies is to create some kind of tool. Maybe the goal is to create something that would be used by many different people, kind of generically useful. Whereas an end user programmer, there probably are many more of this type of person where the goal is not necessarily to become a software engineer or code all day or create software that's used by many people, but the goal instead is to be able to do better biology by learning how to code. Okay, so there's kind of the needs of both of those groups are important. I'm going to focus a little bit more, at least in my mind, I'm thinking a little bit more of end user programmers and their needs. Okay, and a couple of characteristics about these end users is that often they're writing computer scripts, maybe in Python or R. They're often relatively small computer scripts, and sometimes or many times that code might only be used on one particular project. It doesn't need to be super fast all the time or super efficient code. We want to get the job done, but also make sure that the code works properly. Okay, so at BYU, we have an undergraduate program in bioinformatics. And the first course that we have students take is called Introduction to Bioinformatics. And we teach a little bit of bash scripting, a little bit of the basics of just what computers are and how they work. But most of the course is focused on Python programming. So we start them out with some really basic programming exercises, go through a bunch of assignments as we build their skills. And in total, we have 184 Python programming exercises that we invite them to work on throughout the semester. We also give programming-oriented exams where they have to go to what we call a testing center, where they don't have access to the internet. They have to demonstrate an ability to write code independently. Let's see, I was going to say something else, but I don't remember what it was. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of what these are like, these are abbreviated versions of a few of the exercises that we give to students. So I'm just going to read through these. Suppose that you work for the Forest Service and your job is to observe wildlife. Write a Python function that, given lists of animals and their weights, returns the name of the individual with the lowest weight. Or write a Python function that identifies simple sequence repeats in a given DNA sequence, and specifically use a regular expression to identify, so if you're not familiar with that, it's a pattern, a text pattern, to identify all series of AT nucleotides that repeat 3 or 4 times and are preceded and followed by a G or C nucleotide. And one more, use the pandas package to read and filter a data file with clinical information from endometrial cancer patients, and then use the Seaborn package. So this is a package in Python that you can use to create graphics to create a box plot illustrating the data in a particular way. And we give them some details about that. Okay, so we give these to our students, and we've had I think it's been a really successful course. We've had a lot of students who are molecular biology or genetics students who don't really have an interest in programming, who take the course and really get excited about bioinformatics and often change their majors to it. Well, so as ChatGPT came out, I started to hear about its capabilities and that it could generate code from text. And so I thought, well, let me take some of these 184 exercises and throw them into ChatGPT and see what happens. And then depending on that, let me think about what does that mean for me and my students. So that's what I did. And just to give you an idea, you can just copy and paste text into it or write the text, and it'll give you code, which in many cases is functional. So I tried it for a few of my exercises and found that it worked. And so then the next step was to do a formal analysis where we tested all 184 of these exercises. We didn't test the ones from our exams because we kind of want to keep those under wraps, but we tested those 184 to see how it would do. Okay, so let's talk about methods a little bit. We copied each prompt into ChatGPT, and we also included in the prompt some text that explained how the code would be tested, including the expected outputs. And we give the same information to our students. On some of the problems, like the one that I mentioned with pandas and seaborn, we give them data files that they need to be able to parse. So we also give the data, sometimes in abbreviated form, to ChatGPT so that it can kind of get a sense for what it needs to do, a little better sense. Okay, after it produced output, we took the output from ChatGPT, the code, and we put it into an auto grader, the same auto grader that we use with our students to see if it would pass the tests that we give our students and kind of simulate the process as if it were a student. Just a little side note, we use this auto grader called Code Buddy. This is actually one from my lab that we've created. I'm really excited about it. It has some really fun features. So if you're interested in using an auto grader, maybe in one of your courses, I'd love to talk to you and see if that might be useful to you. And I won't go through the features, but there are some things I think that other auto graders don't have. Okay, a little note here. In our course, these programming exercises are formative. So that's education speak for meaning that we're trying to help them learn and go through the process of learning as much as anything. So we do allow students multiple attempts. We don't expect that they'll get their code exactly right every time on the first time or punish them if they don't. We want to give them multiple attempts, and through that process of trying and failing and then learning from that, we hope that they will learn in that process. Okay, so with ChatGPT, if the output that we got with the code that it generated did not match the expected outputs, we continued the conversation with ChatGPT for up to 10 interactions. We kind of concluded, based on the literature and based on what we expected, that if it didn't figure it out in 10, that was probably not worth continuing to try to interact with the model and see how if it could figure it out. One caveat here, so the evaluator, so that was me, I'm an instructor, not a student. So the way that I interacted with the model probably is different than many students would interact with the model, but I did my best to kind of pretend to be a student or kind of be naive in the way that I interacted with it, and not commenting on the code that it generated, just whether or not it produced the right outputs, or I would give it an error message, things like that, but trying to simulate how a student would interact with it. Okay, let's talk about some results. So on this graph I have on the x-axis is showing the number of interactions that I had for each of the exercises with ChatGPT. And so in one interaction, it solved about 3/4 of our programming exercises. Within 7 attempts, it solved 97.3% of those exercises, so almost all of them. You can see the 5 there on the right, so let's just talk a little bit about those. One of these exercises was one where the code needed to be able to identify CPG islands, and it did a pretty good job, but there was one edge case where when there were exactly 10% of the sequences were CG pairs, it just struggled for some reason to be able to figure that out. So that's something that a student could, many students could probably adjust the code a little bit to figure that out, make that work. There were a couple of them where it needed to write regular expressions, and when it was working with non-alphanumeric characters, it struggled in some cases with doing that. Other exercises with regular expressions, it did quite well on those. And then there were some prompts where they were kind of longer, maybe a little bit more challenging, where sometimes it just had a hard time interpreting what we were trying to get it to do. Just a little more insight here. So on the x-axis on this one, this is the number of lines of code for the instructor's solution. So in CodeBuddy, the instructor has to come up with kind of a master solution, and that's what generates the expected output that the student's output is compared against. And we can use the number of lines of code as sort of a proxy for a difficulty level. It's not a perfect proxy, but can give us some idea of how difficult the problems were. You can see that most of the exercises could be solved with fewer than 10 lines of code, but there were some that took as many as 30 or up to 60 lines of code to solve. And you can see that a couple of the 5 that failed were some of the more challenging ones that required more code, but then others were some that only required a few lines of code. So there's some kind of something interesting going on there, but not a clear pattern of longer ones are more difficult. Okay, so I'm going to go through a bunch of just additional comments, kind of observations that we've come up with as we've thought about this and gone through this. So the first is that these findings indicate a considerable advance over previous large language models. So researchers, including my colleagues in New Zealand, have been studying these for a couple of years, which in machine learning time is kind of an eternity. And the research done before this, not specific to bioinformatics, just with introductory programming exercises, they've been able to get up to 80 to 85% solve rates, but not up to the numbers that we were able to get with ChatGPT. And these other exercises that were tested in the literature previously, none that I found do things like working with data files, graphics, or external Python packages. So it seems like GPT 3.5, which was the model used by ChatGPT at the time, is a considerable advance in this kind of capability over previous models. Okay, maybe this is obvious, but programming remains an important skill for life scientists to learn. So we're not out of a job, and people who are not bioinformaticians still need to be able to learn these skills to be successful in what they're trying to do. Having said that, I think that there is evidence here that large language models do provide useful, could be helpful to people in their programming efforts. Our programming exercises don't necessarily represent the types of tasks that bioinformaticians perform in the real world. We still need to do more research to understand in what ways and to what extent can these models be useful for quote unquote real world types of tasks. But again, I think it shows that there is some capability here that's worth exploring more. A really important point is that functional code validation is critical. So just like any code that you get from the internet or from any other source, you need to check it and make sure that it works and does what you want it to do. And you may need to test edge cases and more challenging circumstances to make sure it works the way it should. And I think this is something that instructors are going to need to increasingly emphasize in their courses, is how do we teach students how to validate their code. LLMs have potential to make research more efficient. I'm going to quote Jason Williams up here real quick. He said, "I'd love to see 50 to 75% of easy bioinformatics questions answered by GPT, freeing up people to work on the hard things." So I think there's some potential there. These models are trained on millions of code examples. There are some types of tasks that they've seen many different times in many different ways. And so if we can, we or people who are not bioinformaticians, if we can delegate some of those tasks to the model, then that could really free us up to work on other tasks. Just an anecdote for me, I use ChatGPT a lot, but it's not always to generate code. A lot of times it's as an alternative to a Google search. Maybe there's a parameter in ggplot2 or some kind of function or some kind of error that I'm getting. I can often throw it into ChatGPT and it'll give me back some helpful results many times. And there's actually some data to support the fact that other people are doing this. So as you can see here on this article title, in the month of March, traffic on Stack Overflow was down by 14% from the month before. So I think a lot of people are using ChatGPT as an alternative to that. LLMs have potential to make education more efficient. One example of that is this tool called Conmigo that some of you might have heard of. So with Khan Academy, you have kids and others who are learning how to do math and science, and instead of having a human be able to help them with that, they came up with this chatbot that uses GPT behind the scenes. And the idea here is not to just give them the answer, but to kind of use the models in a constrained way, to give them just enough help that they're still learning, but it's more efficient, the learning process, they hope. I'm actually working on planning a study kind of along these lines. So if any of you are interested in chatting with me, I'd love to talk to you about that. Okay, another observation, prompt engineering, quote unquote, is a useful task. Okay, so this is the idea that knowing how to interact with the model, what kind of wording, explaining things clearly is kind of a challenging task. And so with this study that we did, we used programming exercises that had been refined over many years with feedback from students and teaching assistants. So I felt like those were really clearly written. But if you're just kind of typing something up real quick, it may or may not work well. You have to really give it some thought about how you're interacting with the model. And sometimes it can be cognitively taxing or challenging. Sometimes you just want it to do something different than it's doing, and you don't always know how to communicate with the model to help it do what you need it to do. And then the last point, instructors may need to reconsider how they assess students. So if students can go and get fully functional code from ChatGPT or other similar types of tools, then we need to think, okay, what things should we be assessing and how should we be assessing them? Just one point on this, there are some researchers in Finland who recently did a study where they used a large language model to generate, based on the students' code solutions, they generated multiple choice questions and gave those to the students based on the code. So the idea there was that if they had just copied the code from ChatGPT or a similar model and didn't really understand it, they wouldn't be able to answer those questions very well. And it would kind of be an indicator that they were, maybe it wasn't cheating, but at least that they weren't understanding well enough. And it could give them or their instructors feedback on what to do based on that. I think we have a preprint out. I'd love for you to check it out. I actually realized after I put this on here that the GitHub repository is not linked from the preprint, but there is a GitHub repository that if you want that, I can send it to you. It has our full results, the conversation transcripts, and the analysis code that we used. And again, there's a link to CodeBuddy there. So any questions?
Thank you so much. A question over there. While Lisanna, can I ask you to help as if installing the presentation while I'm can you help as if with installing the presentation while I go through the questions here in the room? Okay, I'll check the question online. So I'll go first on the first question. Okay, here first.
What about grading? Can you get all the solution from the student and just throw them into ChatGPT and ask to grade the solutions, so we don't need to write any code to grade it?
I'd have to think a little bit more about that. In the case of these programming exercises, it's sort of just cut and dried, like either their code matches the output or it doesn't. So we were able to automate that with our auto grader. But I think like if there were a more subjective submission that a student was making, or like a larger project or something like that, I think there definitely is some potential to use a large language model to do that kind of grading. Yeah.
Yep. Thanks a lot for that super interesting talk. Enjoyed a lot. I think the results you find don't really correlate with sort of personal experience I have, and I think also my colleagues have. So basically, I think when I speak with my colleagues, I basically say it never gets it right. And I think the examples you showed here that you gave, I mean, I believe that it would get 97% of those right because they are really, really very simple. But as soon as it gets a little bit logic, right, like the regular expression you have, so you put a few more conditions on, then I mean it totally doesn't get it, right? And that's why I think we have this feeling that it never gets it right. And so I was wondering is and you mentioned prompt engineering. So I wonder if you could reflect on to what extent, so these are, so when you present something for students, right, you would be very, very careful with how you formulate the question. While if I'm just sitting and chatting with ChatGPT, I'd maybe be less sloppy. So I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the prompt engineering and also the real world situation where it's a little bit more complex.
Yeah, I'll try to answer that. The way that I'm thinking of it for my own use and maybe how others would use it is not to try to ask it to do too much or to kind of replace me in my efforts, but more to be a helpful assistant by my side who I can assign maybe relatively simple tasks that are cut and dried, but that maybe I don't want to take the time or that I don't want to have to go look up how to do it, that I can assign those to this helpful assistant to be able to help me accomplish that part of the code that I'm working on. As far as the prompt engineering, I don't know, I guess, yeah, I guess I don't know if I have any answer on that one. Yeah.
There's another question here online. Someone asked, so does it mean then that ChatGPT is going to replace the, what was the question again? To replace bioinformaticians in the future?
Definitely, I would say not in the near future. So what it may help with, though, is, for example, at a lot of large research universities, there's a lack of computational staff to be able to help people with their research. There are a lot of people who are sitting on data, not knowing how to analyze it. And I think if they can, at least if we can give them a way that they can make sure that these models are giving them valid code or, you know, valid resources to work with, that could be a useful resource for them to use in lieu of being able to use computational staff to complete some of those tasks.
Thank you for the great talk. So I was wondering if there's any correlation between the questions that your digital student missed and those that your human students missed, and potentially tangentially, did any of the misses from your digital student lead you to refactor the questions you're asking your human students to make them more clear and more successful for your students?
Yeah, so the answer to the second part, I'll answer first. And the answer is yes. We didn't change the text very much, but there were a few cases where ChatGPT, we felt like it would have solved the problems if the prompt were a little bit more clear. So that prompted us to be able to go back and revise those and make them more clear. And I think that's actually, if you're creating new exercises for students, throwing them into ChatGPT and seeing if it can understand can be a really useful thing to do. As far as whether the model is failing on similar ones to students, it's a little bit tricky for me because a couple of them come towards the end of the semester. And by then, students tend to be kind of burnt out, and only the really diligent students are the ones that are still working on things. So it's a little bit tricky to know if that's the case. But I think that's a great question and something I want to look more into. Yeah.
So given the fact that these models get so good at generating code, do you think that we should focus more on something like test-driven development, like teaching students how to write tests and analyze code, more so than particular syntax?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's important. We need to teach them how to test code, and I think we need to do a better job of that. I think it's still important to be able to teach fundamental programming skills, just to be able to, I don't think it's ever really a good thing if we're just copying and pasting stuff without understanding it. I think we have to understand the code that we're using. We're just going to use that tool to make us more efficient in doing it. There's probably there's probably more to it than that, but that's kind of just my first response.
I just was curious if it was using GPT-4 or if it was the earlier model.
It was earlier, it was 3.5. So I did these tests back in January with one of the earlier versions of ChatGPT.
Because I know they've definitely passed a lot more tests based on the publication. So yeah.
Yeah.